Hi, I'm Dr. Wade McNair. This e-lecture is going to be focused on the consulting process. In an earlier e-lecture, we talked about what is org development. In this e-lecture, we're going to be talking about what is the consultative process that we go through in designing, developing, and supporting organizations. So I want to talk to you about this concept of a total engagement model. The total engagement model is a 7-step process that allows any consultant in any project, whether they're an internal consultant in the organization or an external consultant hired by the organization. There are 7 steps that we go through to ensure total engagement from the moment we have that first conversation to the completion of that engagement. As a consultant, there are 7 steps, and they happen to all start with the letter D. So let me take just a brief moment to go through what those 7 steps are, and in further e-lectures, we'll dig deeper into each one of those steps. So the first step is discover. In the discovery step is where we're beginning to form that relationship with the client, whether that's an internal client or an external client. It allows us to have that moment of understanding who we are and get a better picture of the dynamics within the organization. The second step is define. In the definition phase is where we look at the scope of the project. What exactly are we looking to accomplish? And in what timing? And how do we know that we've accomplished what we think we want to accomplish? It is here where we look at the dynamics between the client organization and the consultant. And we look to create that scope, that piece of work, that documentation that we can come to agreement on that says, this is the contract, this is the agreement, this is the scope of which my services will support and how that's laid out. We call that the define step. Once we have that, we move into design, development, and deployment. The reason why I put these 3 together is because often they happen interchangeably. Even though these are steps, you may be designing one component while developing another and deploying a third. And you have this iterative process that goes from design, development to deploy, managing multiple lanes. So we're going to spend some time talking about that in a little bit. Design, develop, and deploy are probably the largest area or bulk of work that a consultant will do within an organization. Here's the important note, though. Most consultants jump from discovery to design. They'll sit in a meeting and they'll have an initial discussion, and then they'll jump right into what their ideas are, how to change things, what they should go. Or the client will say, and this is what we want, will you do that for us? And that's a challenge that every consultant needs to be aware of and hold themselves accountable to say, no, there is a second step. And that second step is clearly defining what this engagement is going to look like. If we don't do the definition here, when we wind up back here on step number 6, where we determine our level of success, did we do what we said we would do? Were we able to align with the expectations of the organization? If we didn't clearly define in stage 2, then we have some real problems when we get through to the end. Misunderstandings, misexpectations, And all of a sudden, your total engagement becomes a disengaged project. Once we've gone through these 6 stages, the final stage, which is 7, is that of debrief. Once debrief has happened and we've had the opportunity to be able to go through and look at the whole project, starting with discovery, all the way through deployment, determining the outcomes, did we meet them, did we exceed them, debrief allows us to have lessons learned. And these lessons learned often provide an opportunity to discover new areas of development within the organization. And it just continues over and over and over and over again. Discover, define, design, develop, deploy, determine, and debrief. So if we look at these stages here, we have to ask ourselves, how are they different for an internal consultant versus an external consultant? And the best way to define internal versus external is internal is on payroll, external is on invoice. Easiest way to look at, am I an internal consultant or an external consultant? Both are seeking to use planned culture change, leveraging science and theory to move the organization from one state to another, from its current position to its next position. So how does this differ if I'm an internal consultant versus an external consultant? I want to talk about that for just a minute. When we look at discovery, discovery often is an area where external consultants spend a lot of effort and time. Because an external consultant doesn't necessarily know who are the stakeholders, who is the person making the decision, who is the person funding it, who is the person that's going to be saying yay or nay on whether that's a successful project. So a lot of time and energy goes into discovery for external consultants. Internal consultants, whether you're part of an HR team or an improvement team or whether you're part of a formal org development team, tends to be a little bit easier because you already know who the players are. You understand the culture more, so then you can move into defining a lot sooner than an external consultant. It is here in this discovery where we really want to identify what are the specifics of the culture we're working with. What are those things that are critical, that are anchors, that are things that cannot be changed? And what are those things that can be grown and evolved? And what are the things that need to be thrown away and replaced with whatever the new may be? Definition is an area where external consultants spend some time. They often have a standard format, a standard set of questions that are asked. Here is where in the definition there's a lot of formats that we have as individual consultants, questions we want to ask, specific data we want to gather so that we can do the what, so what, and now what. Be able to do that as an external consultant, it's much more formal. Inside organizations, this is an area where internal consultants struggle. And they struggle because it could have just been an email that was sent. Hey, I think we should update this. And now that becomes this area of definition. One of the largest challenges internal consultants suffer is not effectively documenting the scope of a project, being able to clearly define the outcomes. And once those outcomes are defined, being able to continue to keep accountability with those outcomes. Design, develop, and deploy, those are things that can vary. If it's an external consultant that is doing the work, often they do that on their own, or they will work with a team or an organization that they're a part of to be able to create the alpha, the beta, the kappa, the products to be able to review. It goes into a formal process of review for design. They then go ahead if there's a need to develop product, develop process, develop documentation, a training manual, or a toolkit, whatever it may be. And then deployment. Very similar. Again, these three are very similar in the actions, but as an external consultant, that usually rests on the shoulders of that consultant. As an internal consultant, we often leverage resources within the organization. Maybe we partner for the design with marketing and with the strategy team. The actual development, we'd go through a vendor, or maybe we'd use an instructional designer that's on staff. Deployment, we may have an internal project manager or a project management office that allows us to leverage those things. So one of the challenges for an external consultant in stages 3, 4, and 5 is truly understanding what resources are available within the organization and determining who will do what. As an internal consultant, the challenge is often that these items get offloaded onto other departments or function, and that consultant loses the level of influence and authority on that process. So 3 things that are relatively the same outputs, very different dynamics for that individual. Determining success is a challenge often for internal consultants, because determining success often has a direct impact to their pay, to their bonus structure, to their promotion within the organization. And often what will happen is internal consultants will do absolutely everything to ensure that determination is they did a great job. External consultants don't have that pressure to perform in the same way and are willing to say, hold on a second, as we're discussing these, we're off track and we need to look at that course correction. And it's important that external consultants have that ability to speak into that process just as much as internal consultants do. So, same 7 steps, very different dynamics if you are an internal consultant or an external consultant. Let's talk for a moment on the role of a consultant. There's a number of roles that a consultant can take, whether they're internal or external, and it has to do with the power and authority, accountability, and responsibility that that individual has for that project, program, process, or tool. Everywhere from you could have ownership. The consultant owns the project, they're leading the project, they are in charge of all the scheduling of the project, all of the steps, all of the documentation. Everything funnels through that one consultant who owns that project as a single source of ownership. We also have what I call stewardship. Stewardship is where the consultant is actively engaged with a core group of individuals, and his or her responsibility is to steward that team and ultimately make those decisions that need to be made. So high level of authority, but not autonomy. So where ownership, full autonomy and accountability, stewardship done within a steering committee, a task force, a group that is actively engaged. We can also have consultants as guides. We're part of a larger team. We're asked to give information. We're able to point people in the right direction. We're there as a sounding board, as an individual that can actively engage and guide the project. But again, this lowers our authority, lowers our accountability for the overall of the project. And then finally, we've got the advisor, often also seen as the auditor. This is someone who simply is looking at it going, do I see anything wrong? They're used as a cursory view, a consultant that will look at maybe a employment handbook and just look through, make sure everything's okay, give a sign off, literally advising on whether something is good, bad, needs improvement. So the higher level of accountability, the higher level of power, the higher level of authority changes the dynamic of that relationship between that consultant and the organization. My personal favorite space to be, stewardship, where I find the greatest impact to the organization is not being the controlling power and having everything owned by me, but by working together in a collaborative process with key stakeholders and teams. Because ultimately, as an organizational consultant, if I'm external to the organization, I don't ever want to go back to the organization and do the same thing again. I want to be able to equip, empower, and engage this group of people to learn from that process. So when they need to do another update of a textbook or another update of a handbook, that they know how to do it because they've now been taught how. And they can do it on their own, and I'm used within that organization for a different kind of engagement. Ultimately, that should be the same goal for internal consultants as well. Asking that question, am I doing the same thing year after year after year after year for the same people? I challenge you that maybe you're not stewarding the process, maybe you're taking a little too much ownership of the process. And again, that's around setting expectations between you, your manager, and the rest of the organization as to your specific role and responsibilities. The last thing I want to talk about as it relates to the total engagement model and the roles here is to make sure that we understand where our value as consultants lies. And it lies within this concept of managing planned change. Let's take a look. We're going to go ahead and this axis here is going to be performance, and this axis here is going to be over time. And everybody in the organization, we have a level of performance that we're at, and we introduce some sort of intervention, some sort of change, some sort of activity that is trying to move that organization from its current state to its future state, from its where it is now to where it will be next. And what happens is naturally there is a dip in performance that ultimately increases the level of performance if that intervention is done well. Ultimately, we want the organization to go from point A to point B. We want it to be more effective. We want it to be more efficient. We want the processes to run more smoothly. We want less errors. We want more outputs. Whatever those ideas are and those determining factors for success, what we do realize is that there is going to be this dip. It is up to us as organizational consultants to do two things. One, make sure the organization is aware that a dip will take place. And two, to do everything in our power to mitigate the impact of that dip. The space between what could be and what is, as it relates to that performance dip, rests on the shoulders of the organizational consultant. Where do we bring the most value in a total engagement? It may be that, yes, we spend lots of times and we do great outputs and we do great PowerPoints and a great toolkit and we allow for great communication plans and we've got great marketing materials and new process documents, and all of these things are great. But if we haven't minimized the impact of performance to change, that change dip that every human being goes through when having to deal with change, then we haven't done our jobs. Let's put it more simply. Most people know how to drive. Well, let me rephrase that. Most people have a license to drive. And when we're driving, when we're 16 years old, we can go take the course and we can read all of the information, and we get into the car and not one of us immediately drives well. We may have all of the desire and education and ability but there's this curve, and we do things like screeching and causing our parents and fellow family members pain as they're teaching us how to drive. You see, the organization will go through that pain. They will go through that learning journey, that performance dip. The challenge for us is not whether they're going to go through that change, whether they're going to experience a performance dip. It's how deep will that dip be? It's our responsibility, our value proposition as an organizational consultant is that in planned cultural change, we are minimizing the impact of that change so that the organization can be more effective sooner to be able to meet the objectives that we've determined to be success.